Philadelphia, 1982. The city didn't sleep because fear never slept. In the alleys, in the boardrooms, in the quiet of union halls, one man's shadow stretched further than any headline. His name was Nicodemo Scarfo. They called him Little Nicky. He wasn't the loudest boss, but he was the one everyone feared. Because in Scarfo's world, betrayal wasn't a possibility, it was an inevitability. And paranoia? That was his empire. Philadelphia, 1982. The skyline was still proud, but the streets told a different story. Empty factories stood like hollowed-out monuments to better days. Broken glass winked from sidewalks that hadn't been swept in months. Entire blocks smelled of rust and rot, as if the city itself was bleeding out. America was shifting. Steel towns were dying. Jobs that had once built families disappeared overnight. Men who had woken every morning for decades to the whistle of the plant now sat idle on porches, beer cans stacked like trophies of defeat. And when work left, something darker moved in to fill the space. Crime, corruption, and whispers that could cut sharper than knives. Philadelphia was no stranger to organized crime. For decades, the city's underworld was another layer of governance, like City Hall, like the unions, like the police department itself. Everybody knew it was there. Everybody knew who pulled the strings. But in 1982, that world didn't just run parallel to Philadelphia. It began to own it. And at the center of it all was one man. Nicodemo Scarfo. They called him Little Nicky. A small man barely 5'5", with sharp features and eyes that never rested. If you passed him on the street, you might mistake him for an ordinary old Italian man heading to buy bread. But in Philly, no one ever made that mistake. Not twice. Scarfo didn't roar like John Gotti in New York. He didn't wear $1,000 suits or flash gold rings for the newspapers. No, Scarfo preferred shadows. He ruled not by charm, not by loyalty, but by fear. And fear worked differently here. It wasn't the sudden terror of a gun pointed at your face. It was slower, heavier, like a fog that seeped into every corner of your life until you forgot what breathing fresh air felt like. Philadelphia in 1982 felt like it belonged to him. The unions? The construction contracts? The bars, the back rooms, the corners where numbers were played and debts were collected. All of it bent to his paranoia. He didn't trust anyone. Not his friends. Not his crew. Not even his family. And because he trusted no one, everyone feared him more than they feared the law. Walk into a neighborhood restaurant back then and you might feel it. The silence when he entered. Forks pausing mid-air. Conversations dying in throats. Little Nicky didn't have to speak. He didn't have to raise his voice. Just his presence was enough to remind you. In this city, betrayal was always only one step away. To the people of Philadelphia, 1982 wasn't just another year on the calendar. It was the year paranoia became power. It was the year Little Nicky took the throne, not by being loved, not by being respected, but by making sure everyone was too terrified to imagine life without him. And as the night stretched long and restless, the city whispered his name in the dark. Scarfo. Little Nicky. The most paranoid Don Philadelphia had ever seen. Long before Philadelphia learned to whisper his name, Nicodemo Scarfo was just another boy in an Italian immigrant family. Born in 1929 in Brooklyn, New York, he came into the world small, wiry, and angry. His parents had crossed the Atlantic like millions of others, chasing a dream of America that promised freedom but often delivered struggle. In those neighborhoods, survival wasn't about what you had, it was about who you knew and how willing you were to fight for respect. For a boy as short and hot-tempered as Nicky, fights came easy. He was quick with his fists, quicker with his mouth, and quicker still to take offense. Every slight, every joke about his height, every sideways look, he took it as an insult carved into his skin. The kids who grew up around him learned fast. You didn't cross Nicky Scarfo. He might not win every fight, but he'd never stop swinging. That stubborn streak, what others called paranoia, was already there, growing roots before he could even spell the word. His family moved from Brooklyn to South Jersey, chasing steady work and a chance to escape the crowded tenements. But the move didn't soften him. If anything, it sharpened the edge. Atlantic City in the 1940s was a strange place, part vacation town, part gangster's playground. Tourists came for the boardwalk, the bright lights, the illusion of glamour. But behind every neon sign, there was a man collecting money for protection, a dealer moving dice under the table, a lone shark keeping ledgers in his head. For a boy like Nicky, this wasn't just scenery. It was education. He wasn't tall enough for sports. He wasn't book smart enough for school. But he had something else, a hunger to matter. In a country that didn't see much in him, He was determined to carve out his own power, even if it was just in the shadows. He drifted into small-time rackets, running errands, carrying envelopes, learning the rules of silence that every mobster drilled into their bones. Say little. Listen more. For Scarfo, that fit like a second skin. He was never a talker, never the guy spinning stories in a bar. He sat in the corner, eyes darting, ears sharp, absorbing everything. And if there was one thing he absorbed most, it was this: trust would get you killed. It wasn't paranoia yet. Not the consuming kind that would later define him. Back then, it was survival instinct. The immigrant neighborhoods of South Jersey taught him a lesson America itself would repeat in different ways. Nobody gives you anything. You take it. And once you have it, you guard it like the world is waiting to rip it from your hands. By the time Scarfo was a young man, the seeds of paranoia had already sprouted. He had learned to measure people by their eyes, their hesitation, their silence. He'd learned to keep his circle small, his trust smaller. And he'd learned that the quickest way to control a room wasn't to shout over it, but to make everyone afraid of what you might be thinking. Years later, when Philadelphia bent under his paranoia, those who had known him as a boy weren't surprised. To them, little Nicky had always been that way, watchful, tense, ready to believe betrayal was just around the corner. America gave him opportunity, but it also gave him suspicion. And he would turn both into the foundation of his empire. Nicodemo Domenico Scarfo entered the world in 1929, the year the Great Depression began its long chokehold on America. His parents, Italian immigrants, carried with them the familiar story of millions. A journey across the Atlantic in search of a better life, only to land in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce and prejudice was plentiful. For the Scarfo family, the dream of America was painted in shades of struggle. Their Brooklyn apartment was cramped, the walls thin enough to hear neighbors argue through. Work was long, money was short, and respect for Italian newcomers was rarer still. In those days, Italians were lumped together with other immigrants, seen as outsiders, second-class citizens who spoke the wrong language and carried the wrong names. In this world, young Nicky grew up fast. He was small, barely 5 feet as a boy and never destined to be much taller. Other kids teased him, calling him runt, shrimp, or worse. Each insult was like a stone lodged under his skin. He never forgot. And unlike other boys who might have laughed it off, Nicky fought back. With fists, with rage, with the kind of intensity that left a mark even when he lost. And he lost often. But he never stayed down. That was his reputation early on. The boy who would fight you again and again, until the very thought of dealing with him became more trouble than it was worth. That stubbornness, some called it pride, others called it madness, was the seed of something darker. When the family later moved to South Jersey, they carried their habits and their accents into a new world. South Jersey was different from Brooklyn, but not kinder. Atlantic City was rising, bright lights on the boardwalk, tourists with pockets full of cash, gangsters pulling strings behind every carnival game and nightclub stage. On the surface, it was a vacation town, a place where families from New York and Philadelphia came to taste glamour for a weekend. But beneath the neon glow, it was a city run on debt, vice, and silence. For young Nicky, this was an education no school could provide. He wasn't the type to stand out in sports and he wasn't drawn to books. What he noticed instead was how men carried themselves in those backrooms, how a nod or a handshake could change the fate of a whole neighborhood. He learned that in America, respect didn't come from being tall or smart or polite. It came from making people afraid to cross you. The local mobsters didn't miss the wiry kid who was always hanging around, watching more than he spoke. They saw the temper. They saw the persistence. They saw, most importantly, his willingness to take offense at the smallest slight, and his obsession with payback. In a world where loyalty was fragile and betrayal common, a man like that was useful. Nicky started small. He ran errands, carried envelopes, acted as muscle when someone needed to be pushed around. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that made headlines. But he was learning the unspoken code. Keep your mouth shut, keep your eyes open, and above all, never trust too quickly. That last rule suited him perfectly. Because even as a young man, Scarfo lived in a state of low-level suspicion. If a friend arrived late, maybe it was because he'd been talking to someone he shouldn't. If someone laughed a little too long at a joke, maybe they were laughing at him. These thoughts didn't just come and go. They stayed, nested in his mind, waiting to hatch. The immigrant neighborhoods taught him harsh lessons. In South Jersey, Italian Americans were not part of the mainstream. They were still fighting for a place, still struggling against prejudice. And in that fight, trust was a luxury. You learned to smile at your neighbor, then double-bolt the door. You learned to drink with your friends, then wonder which one of them might be whispering to the police after midnight. Scarfo took these lessons to heart. Where others might eventually soften with age, he hardened. Each slight became proof of what he already believed. The world was against him. Each betrayal, real or imagined, was a warning of worse to come. By his 20s, the shape of the man he would become was already clear. He wasn't charismatic like some of his peers. He wasn't the type to fill a room with laughter, or to win allies with generosity. What he had was presence, the kind of presence that unsettled people even when he was silent. He could sit in the corner of a bar, nursing a drink, and still make the whole room feel watched. Some people said his small stature made him meaner. That being underestimated as a boy carved something permanent into him, a need to prove he was more dangerous than anyone suspected. Others said it was deeper than that Scarfo was born wired differently, built for suspicion, for paranoia, for the cold comfort of fear. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. By the time little Nicky entered the orbit of organized crime in Atlantic City, he was already carrying the habits that would define his rule. A small circle, a quick temper, and a certainty that betrayal was always just one breath away. America had offered him a chance at respect, but he would never believe it came freely. To Scarfo, every nod, every handshake, every ounce of loyalty was temporary. And temporary things needed constant guarding. The boy who grew up fighting over insults in Brooklyn had become a man who saw enemies in every shadow. And for Philadelphia, that paranoia was only beginning. By the 1950s, Atlantic City was a strange contradiction. To tourists, it was bright lights, salt air, and a promise of escape. Families strolled the boardwalk with cotton candy, gamblers filled the casinos, and jazz drifted out of neon-lit bars. But behind every storefront, there was another story, the story of who owned the machines, who took a cut from the dice, who made sure debts were paid on time. Atlantic City had long been a playground for mobsters, and for a young Nicodemo Scarfo, it was the perfect classroom. He wasn't a big man. He didn't have the charisma to run numbers out in the open, to flash a smile and draw people in. But he had something else, a willingness to do what others avoided. If a job was dirty, dangerous, or downright cruel, Scarfo would take it. Not because he loved the work, but because it meant moving closer to the center of power. His early tasks were small, running envelopes, collecting payments, standing watch outside backroom meetings. But even in those roles, he carried himself with a cold intensity. Other young men might joke or flirt with waitresses while they waited. Scarfo stayed silent, eyes scanning the room like a hawk circling prey. It unnerved people. And that, in its own way, was power. Scarfo came under the wing of mob figures who controlled construction rackets in Atlantic City. Construction was a goldmine in post-war America. New hotels, new casinos, new apartments rising like weeds. Every brick laid meant someone got paid twice, once for the job and once for the protection. Scarfo learned fast that concrete wasn't poured without permission, and permission always had a price. For him, this world made sense. In school, rules had felt arbitrary. On the streets, life felt chaotic. But in the mob, everything had a cost, and every cost had an enforcer. It was order through fear, and Scarfo understood fear better than most. He earned a reputation for his temper. Small slights, a bartender who took too long with his drink, a laborer who questioned his authority, could trigger eruptions. He'd reach for a knife quicker than anyone else in the room. Some called it recklessness. Others saw it for what it was, a message. In a business built on intimidation, Scarfo was proving he wasn't someone to underestimate. There was one incident people remembered clearly. A dispute broke out over a construction contract, two men arguing about which crew would handle a lucrative job. Voices rose, chairs scraped, fists nearly flew. Then Scarfo, small and quiet in the corner, stepped forward. Without a word, he pulled a blade and slashed the table between them. The room went silent. He hadn't touched either man, but the message was clear. Keep arguing, and next time the blade wouldn't stop at the wood. Moments like that earned him a reputation. Little Nicky might have been small, but he was dangerous. In Atlantic City, he learned another lesson too, the value of silence. Mobsters didn't survive by boasting. They survived by listening, by staying invisible until the moment they needed to strike. Scarfo, who had always been more watcher than talker, fit the mold perfectly. He learned to sit in smoky backrooms, absorbing secrets, cataloging who was allied with whom and, most importantly, who might be plotting behind the scenes. And always he thought about betrayal. If someone shook his hand, Scarfo wondered what they whispered after he left. If someone smiled at him, he wondered what they might do with their back turned. Even in these apprentice years, the paranoia that would define him was already seeping into his bones. He didn't trust anyone fully, not the men who gave him jobs, not the friends he drank with after, not even his own kin. This constant suspicion wasn't weakness. It was survival. Atlantic City was full of men who had died because they trusted too easily. Scarfo swore he wouldn't be one of them. By the early 1960s, his role in the Philadelphia mob family had solidified. He wasn't yet a boss, not even close. But people knew his name. They knew his size didn't match his temper, and his temper didn't match his patience for betrayal. In a world where loyalty was a commodity, little Nicky Scarfo was already making it clear. Cross him once and you might not live to cross him twice. Atlantic City had trained him well. It taught him that violence didn't need to be loud to be effective. That a man could rule a room without saying a word, so long as people feared what he might do. And most of all, it taught him the one lesson he would carry into his reign in Philadelphia. Power didn't come from love. It didn't even come from respect. It came from fear. And Scarfo had been mastering fear his whole life. By the late 1970s, Nicodemo little Nicky Scarfo was no longer just an apprentice in Atlantic City. He was climbing into the center of Philadelphia's mob family, an organization already fractured by infighting and pressure from law enforcement. Other men sought to unite the family with charisma, or to dazzle it with wealth. Scarfo took another path. He had no intention of being loved. He had no illusions about being respected. He didn't care if people laughed at his size or whispered about his temper. What mattered, what he built his empire on, was fear. Fear, he believed, was the only currency that never devalued. He had watched too many bosses fall because they trusted too much. One wrong man in the inner circle. One cousin who flipped to the FBI. One friend who took a better offer from a rival crew. Scarfo learned from every mistake he observed, and his conclusion was simple: trust no one ever. When Angelo Bruno, the long-reigning boss of the Philadelphia mob, was murdered in 1980, the city's underworld spiraled into chaos. Bruno had been known as the Gentle Don, someone who preferred diplomacy over violence. But in the world Scarfo knew, gentleness was a weakness. Bruno's murder proved that. In the vacuum that followed, bodies piled up as rival factions fought for control. Scarfo watched it all carefully. He didn't throw himself into the bloodbath recklessly, like some of the younger soldiers desperate for position. He stayed quiet, patient, calculating. That patience paid off. By 1981, with enough bodies buried and enough rivals eliminated, Scarfo emerged as the new boss of the Philadelphia crime family. But Scarfo's rule would look nothing like Bruno's. He didn't call for unity. He didn't speak of honor. He didn't pretend the mob was a family. Instead, he turned paranoia into policy. His meetings were tense, silent affairs. Men who had once laughed and toasted together now sat stiffly, eyes down, waiting for Scarfo's voice. He didn't rant or rave. He didn't need to. A single pause, a lingering stare, the faintest shift in his expression. These were enough to send men home sweating, unsure if they'd just earned his favor or signed their death warrant. Scarfo rarely explained himself. Orders came short, sharp, stripped of detail. And that was deliberate. He wanted every man in the room to wonder, why me? Why this? What does he know that I don't? That uncertainty was his weapon. He instituted what many would later describe as a reign of terror. A soldier who hesitated, even briefly, could be marked as untrustworthy. A capo who seemed too ambitious risked immediate elimination. Scarfo's paranoia wasn't just private. It radiated through the entire organization. Everyone was guilty until proven innocent. And proving innocence? That was nearly impossible. This was the difference between Scarfo and other dons. John Gotti in New York courted publicity, paraded through clubs in designer suits, and earned the nickname the Dapper Don. Scarfo despised such vanity. He believed visibility was vulnerability. Where Gotti smiled for cameras, Scarfo kept his blinds drawn tight. But Scarfo was no less theatrical in his own way. His theater was silence. His performance was suspicion. And his audience was a family of men who lived in constant dread of disappointing him. His paranoia was contagious. Men who once trusted each other now second-guessed every word. Friends became informants. Brothers eyed one another across the table with caution. Scarfo had turned the Philadelphia mob into a hall of mirrors. Every reflection distorted, every shadow a potential traitor. For ordinary Philadelphians, the change was palpable. Neighborhood businesses that once paid protection with gritted teeth now paid with trembling hands. Union leaders, once proud and defiant, learned to avert their eyes when Scarfo's name was mentioned. Even seasoned mobsters from New York treated him with wary respect, not because of his power but because of his volatility. Scarfo's size made the contrast even starker. He was barely over 5 feet tall, but his paranoia gave him an aura larger than life. To meet him was to feel watched, measured, and judged in silence. His eyes never softened. His smile never reassured. Every gesture carried the unspoken question, "Are you with me? Or against me?" In Scarfo's world, there was no middle ground. There was one story told among mob insiders. A man in the family made an offhand joke at a dinner, nothing cruel, just a passing remark about Scarfo's height. Scarfo didn't react immediately. He simply finished his meal, raised his glass, and offered a toast. The man laughed, relieved. Days later, he vanished. His body was never found. The message echoed louder than any outburst. Scarfo never forgot and he never forgave. This was how he ruled, by ensuring every man believed he was only one misstep away from doom. But paranoia has a cost. It corrodes from the inside. Scarfo's world was efficient in the short term. Fear kept people in line, debts were collected, profits soared. But cracks were forming. Men whispered in corners, wives begged their husbands to leave, soldiers quietly considered whether the FBI's promise of protection was safer than Scarfo's suffocating suspicion. Scarfo didn't care. To him, cracks were inevitable. Betrayal was inevitable. And when it came, he would meet it with the only weapon he trusted: more fear. By 1982, Philadelphia was his. Not because men loved him. Not because they respected him. But because they knew the truth Scarfo lived by. In his world, you were guilty before you opened your mouth, and only silence might save you. It was a kingdom of paranoia. And Scarfo sat on its throne, not tall, not handsome, not adored, but feared more completely than any boss who came before him. By 1982, Philadelphia was no longer just a city in decline. It was a city in Scarfo's grip. The factories had closed, the jobs had vanished, and the neighborhoods that once thrived on union wages now sagged under unemployment and crime. For most Philadelphians, the city felt tired. Tired of promises, tired of politics, tired of the slow erosion of its streets. But for Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo, the timing was perfect. Weakness was opportunity. And where others saw broken sidewalks, he saw territory waiting to be owned. Scarfo's reign didn't announce itself with fireworks or headlines. It settled like a shadow, creeping across Philadelphia block by block, until it became impossible to tell where the city ended and his paranoia began. The unions, a silent takeover. Philadelphia had always been a union town. Carpenters, laborers, longshoremen, men whose sweat had built the city's skyline and paved its streets. The unions were strong, but they were also vulnerable. With factories closing and construction slowing, leaders scrambled for contracts. Scarfo stepped in, offering protection that was less an offer and more a command. Union halls that once rang with speeches about dignity and brotherhood now echoed with silence when Scarfo's men walked through the doors. Meetings grew shorter. Voices lowered. Deals that once ended with a handshake now ended with an envelope sliding discreetly across a table. Scarfo didn't just skim the unions, he controlled them. No building went up without his cut. No contract was signed without his blessing. Workers learned quickly that a paycheck wasn't worth a bullet, and so they complied. Fear once again did the heavy lifting. The streets, everyday fear. To the average Philadelphian, Scarfo wasn't a celebrity mob boss like John Gotti in New York. His name didn't appear in bold headlines, his picture rarely flashed across the nightly news. But everyone knew him or at least felt his presence. A bar owner late on his payments might find his front window shattered one morning. A grocer who refused to pay protection might find his shelves mysteriously empty after suppliers stopped delivering. A gambler who owed too much might disappear from the neighborhood altogether, his debts erased only by his absence. These weren't random acts of violence. They were reminders that Scarfo's reach extended everywhere, and that paranoia wasn't just his personal trait, it was the city's new law. Inside the family, ruled by terror. Scarfo's paranoia infected the very organization he led. In other families, soldiers could at least pretend loyalty was rewarded. Under Scarfo, loyalty was never enough. Men who had served him faithfully for years were suddenly accused of betrayal, and within days they vanished. Capos who had built their reputations on decades of work found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering when their turn would come. A careless word at dinner, a glance misinterpreted, a pause too long when answering a question, these could all be death sentences. Scarfo didn't need to kill everyone. He only needed to make everyone believe they could be next. That belief kept them in line. Philadelphia's reputation. Other mob families noticed. In New York, bosses who thrived on spectacle shook their heads at Scarfo's methods. But they didn't underestimate him. His paranoia gave him an edge, He was harder to infiltrate, harder to predict, harder to corner. Men who might have betrayed another boss thought twice about betraying Scarfo, because betrayal under him wasn't just punished. It was annihilated. By the mid-1980s, Philadelphia's mob family had gained a reputation across America as one of the most volatile, one of the most paranoid, and one of the most dangerous. Business partners hesitated, not because they doubted Scarfo's strength, but because they feared his suspicion. One wrong step, one wrong look, and Philadelphia became a graveyard. The cost of fear. But fear has a cost. Philadelphia's underworld no longer thrived, it suffocated. Men stopped working together. Alliances collapsed. Soldiers lived like ghosts, haunted by the possibility that they had already been marked for death. Some sought escape, whispering to the FBI in secret, convinced that the government's protection was safer than Scarfo's mercy. Ordinary citizens too felt the weight. Businesses paid more, neighborhoods grew poorer, and a once proud city slid deeper into decay. Scarfo had won control, but the city he ruled was withering under him. The man behind the shadow. Scarfo himself rarely appeared in public. He lived behind curtains drawn tight, his phone lines carefully guarded, his circle shrinking ever smaller. Yet even in absence he was present. People spoke his name in whispers, afraid the walls themselves might carry their words back to him. In the end, this was Scarfo's true legacy in Philadelphia. Not wealth, not glamour, not loyalty. It was a climate of paranoia that blanketed the city from the tallest union hall to the smallest corner bar. Philadelphia under Scarfo wasn't a city of dreams or opportunities. It was a city where every man, woman, and child knew that somewhere out there, unseen but always listening, was little Nicky Scarfo. And he didn't trust anyone. By the mid-1980s, Scarfo's rule had hardened into something closer to a siege. He wasn't just the boss of Philadelphia. He was the jailer, and everyone around him lived in a prison built from suspicion. To understand Scarfo at this stage, you have to understand how he saw the world. Where others saw allies, he saw threats. Where others saw opportunity, he saw traps. His eyes never stopped searching corners, his mind never stopped replaying words, dissecting them, twisting them until every conversation became an interrogation. The paranoia becomes policy. Other mob bosses trusted their inner circles. They had consiglieri, lieutenants, old friends they could lean on. Scarfo believed those were the very men most likely to turn. So he built walls inside walls. Meetings grew smaller. Access to him grew harder. Men who once spoke directly to him now waited days, sometimes weeks, to get a message through. Scarfo preferred it that way. If you had to wait, if you were anxious, if you were sweating over what he might think, you were easier to control. Inside his family, the tension was unbearable. Soldiers whispered to each other only in coded phrases, never knowing who might repeat their words. Capos stopped visiting each other's homes, afraid of being seen plotting. Scarfo's paranoia wasn't just a trait anymore, it was the bloodstream of the organization, the shadow of the FBI. And yet, Scarfo wasn't wrong. The FBI was everywhere. By the Reagan years, federal authorities had grown sharper, better funded, and more determined to dismantle the Mafia. Wiretaps hummed inside restaurants. Bugs clicked under bar counters. Men who thought they were safe in a backroom found their words typed up in FBI reports the next morning. Scarfo's paranoia, in that sense, was justified. He was right to suspect leaks. He was right to believe betrayal was coming. But instead of responding with strategy, he responded with fear. Every whisper became a confession. Every hesitation became proof of guilt. Betrayal among the ranks. The more Scarfo suspected, the more brutal he became. Soldiers who had served him loyally for years were executed over imagined slights. One man hesitated during a meeting. He paused before answering a question. Scarfo took it as a sign. Days later, that man's body was found in the trunk of a car. Another man, who had the misfortune of being too friendly with outsiders, simply vanished. His wife begged for answers. None came. These weren't just punishments. They were lessons for the living. Scarfo didn't want men to trust him. He wanted them to fear that at any moment, their time might be up. Family under suspicion. Even his blood relatives weren't safe. Scarfo began to suspect his own kin of disloyalty. Nephews, cousins, even his children lived under his watchful glare. A wrong phone call, a missed appointment, a rumor overheard at a bar. These were enough to draw his suspicion. Imagine living under that roof. Imagine every dinner table conversation ending with silence, every word measured, every laugh cut short because you didn't know if Scarfo might take it the wrong way. For his family, life wasn't love, it was survival. The cost of constant vigilance. Scarfo rarely slept soundly. Curtains drawn, lights low, he paced hallways like a guard on duty. He demanded updates at all hours, called his men in the dead of night just to test their loyalty, to see if they would answer quickly enough. The paranoia that kept him alive also kept him restless. For him, trust was a myth. The only truth was betrayal, waiting patiently in every shadow. But paranoia, like fear, spreads. His men caught it too. Soon they were second-guessing each other, refusing to share information, keeping secrets not just from the FBI but from their own crew. The organization, once designed to function as a family, was splintering into fragments. Philadelphia feels the strain. Outside, the city itself felt different. Bar owners noticed the tension when Scarfo's men arrived. No jokes, no camaraderie, only stiff silence. Union halls went quiet, as if every conversation might be recorded. Ordinary Philadelphians spoke his name less and less. Not because they'd forgotten him, but because even saying it aloud felt dangerous. It was as if the entire city had absorbed Scarfo's paranoia, living in a fog where danger lurked everywhere but nowhere at once. The inevitable weakness. Here lies the contradiction at the heart of Scarfo's reign. His paranoia made him strong, but it also made him fragile. By suspecting everyone, he drove people away. By punishing imaginary betrayal, he encouraged real betrayal. Men who might have stayed loyal began to ask themselves, why die for a boss who already thinks I'm guilty? And so, little by little, they turned. Some to rivals. Some to the FBI. Each man who flipped confirmed Scarfo's fears, but only because his fears had driven them there in the first place. Scarfo had built his empire on shadows, and now the shadows were closing in. He had turned paranoia into policy, and Philadelphia into a city of silence. But in every silence, betrayal was growing louder. Scarfo's paranoia wasn't just a private burden anymore, it was a contagion. It seeped into the bones of the men around him, spreading like a sickness no one dared name. He began testing his crew in strange, unsettling ways. Sometimes he would feed them false information just to see where it surfaced. If a rumor he invented came back to his ears from another source, he knew someone was talking. Other times he would call meetings at odd hours, expecting absolute obedience. A soldier who arrived late, traffic, family, even illness, was immediately branded suspect. Excuses were meaningless. In Scarfo's eyes, hesitation equaled betrayal. There were stories whispered later, in hushed tones, about how far this paranoia went. One involved a soldier who made the mistake of glancing at Scarfo's glass of wine too long during dinner. Scarfo said nothing that night. But days later, the man was found beaten, his body dumped like garbage. The message was clear. Even looking at what was his could be interpreted as treachery. Even his personal habits reflected the depth of his suspicion. Scarfo rarely ate food he hadn't personally watched being prepared. He avoided restaurants unless he controlled the kitchen. At home, meals were simple, heavily guarded affairs. He often insisted that his men eat first, watching carefully for any signs of poisoning before touching his own plate. Sleep became a kind of performance. He never admitted fatigue, never allowed himself to appear vulnerable. But insiders said he would pace for hours at night, peering through blinds, adjusting locks, checking phones for taps. His home, once meant to be a sanctuary, became another prison, lined with invisible bars built from suspicion. For his family, the weight was unbearable. Imagine living with a man who scrutinized every word, every action, every silence. Children grew up under his gaze like prisoners themselves, trained to measure every gesture. Wives and cousins whispered behind closed doors, terrified that their voices might carry through the walls. In Scarfo's household, affection dried up. Paranoia left no room for love. And still the FBI drew closer. Agents joked, darkly, that Scarfo was doing half their work for them. By killing, alienating, and intimidating his own men, he was driving them straight into government arms. Some joined the witness protection program not out of greed or convenience, but simply to escape the suffocating fear. They reasoned that death at Scarfo's hands was more certain than prison time. What Scarfo failed to see was that paranoia has a breaking point. Fear works best when it balances on a razor's edge. Too little and people rebel, too much and people collapse or defect. Scarfo had crossed that line. His men no longer feared disappointing him, they feared existing near him. And when life itself becomes unbearable, betrayal doesn't feel like betrayal anymore. Feels like survival. Philadelphia, by now, was living inside his paranoia. The city had grown quieter, darker. But in that silence, something louder was forming, the steady, inevitable sound of walls closing in. In most mob stories, family is the last refuge. The world outside may be violent, unstable, treacherous, But home is where a man finds loyalty that cannot be bought, love that cannot be shaken. Husbands find comfort in wives, fathers trust their sons, uncles protect their nephews. Even in crime, family remains sacred. But not in Scarfo's world. For Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo, paranoia respected no boundaries. It seeped through walls, seeped into bedrooms, seeped into Sunday dinners. To him, family wasn't a sanctuary. It was another battlefield, another place where betrayal could hide. Suspicion at the dinner table. Meals in the Scarfo household were tense affairs. Conversations were clipped, laughter rare. His children learned early that words were dangerous. A wrong phrase, a careless comment about who they'd seen or spoken to, could set their father's eyes narrowing, his suspicion sharpening like a blade. Guests were rarer still. Relatives who once might have gathered for birthdays or holidays stopped coming, unwilling to endure the cold atmosphere. Those who did come sat stiffly, watching their tongues, avoiding direct eye contact with Scarfo. Even among kin, everyone acted like suspects. It was said that Scarfo often quizzed his children about their friends, asking names, asking what they talked about, asking if anyone had ever mentioned him. He wasn't looking for connection. He was looking for leaks. The nephews under pressure. Scarfo's paranoia reached especially hard toward his nephews, who he pulled into the business whether they wanted it or not. To be close to him was to be under constant watch. If they succeeded, he suspected arrogance. If they failed, he suspected disloyalty. There was no winning. One nephew reportedly said later that working for Scarfo felt like being on trial every day of your life. The smallest mistake, a missed call, a late arrival, could spark suspicion that you were an informant. And once Scarfo suspected you, the outcome was almost always the same. A home that felt like a prison. Scarfo's house was not warm. Curtains drawn, locks double-checked, phones tapped for static. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress. For his family, it was a prison. Every movement watched, every visitor noted, every word weighed. Children grew up with the constant knowledge that their father trusted no one. They lived under rules that shifted without warning, punishments that came not from disobedience but from imagined slights. It wasn't a childhood. It was training for survival. The absence of affection. Love did not survive paranoia. Scarfo was not a man of embraces or kind words. Even when he smiled, it was measured, calculated. His children and wife learned not to expect warmth, because warmth implied vulnerability. And vulnerability was a luxury Scarfo didn't allow himself. Wives of other mob bosses sometimes enjoyed glamour. Fur coats, fine jewelry, lavish parties. Scarfo's wife lived instead with tension. Money flowed, yes, but happiness did not. She had security but no peace. She had status but no joy. Family as leverage. Scarfo also used family as tools. Nephews, cousins, in-laws, all were pulled into his orbit, whether for errands, enforcement, or surveillance. He believed blood ties gave him leverage, but in truth, they only deepened his paranoia. The closer someone was to him, the more he doubted their loyalty. He saw betrayal everywhere, even in his own kin. The FBI, he believed, would target family first, offering protection or deals in exchange for information. And he wasn't wrong. The government knew blood could cut both ways, binding some men closer but driving others to break. Scarfo's solution wasn't to show love. It was to tighten the leash. The toll on his legacy. The cost of this suspicion was devastating. Instead of building a dynasty, Scarfo built resentment. Children raised under suspicion rarely grew into loyal heirs. Nephews who once admired his power grew bitter, exhausted, terrified. In time, several of his relatives did exactly what he feared. They turned. They became government witnesses testifying against him. Not because they wanted to betray him, but because life under his roof was betrayal already. They had been treated as enemies long before they chose sides. Philadelphia watches. The city noticed. People whispered that if Scarfo couldn't trust his own family, what chance did anyone else have? His paranoia became not just a private weakness but a public legend. Philadelphia's underworld began to see him less as a leader and more as a man imprisoned by his own fear. To ordinary citizens, the idea was chilling. In American culture, family was sacred. Even the worst criminals were supposed to draw a line there. But Scarfo crossed it, proving that his paranoia was absolute. The final isolation. By the late 1980s, Scarfo was more alone than ever. His empire was intact but brittle. His men feared him, his rivals despised him, and his family endured him. He lived in a fortress of suspicion, ruling over ghosts. And yet, in his mind, this was victory. Trust was weakness. Affection was danger. Family was just another battlefield. Scarfo believed that by doubting everyone, he had saved himself. But the truth was simpler and darker. By doubting everyone, he had destroyed the very thing that might have saved him. Scarfo's paranoia had consumed his organization. Now it was consuming his bloodline. And in the silence of his home, behind locked doors and drawn blinds, Philadelphia's most paranoid Don prepared for a downfall he could neither see nor stop, because in his world, even family didn't mean safe. By the late 1980s, Nicodemo little Nicky Scarfo had built his empire on suspicion. But paranoia, no matter how sharp, cannot stop time. And time was no longer on his side. The same fear that had kept his men in line had also driven many of them to the arms of federal agents. For years, Scarfo had believed the FBI lurked in every corner, every shadow, every whispered conversation. Now, for the first time, he wasn't just imagining it. They were really there. The Reagan-era crackdown. America in the 1980s was waging a war on organized crime. Under President Ronald Reagan, federal funding for law enforcement surged. RICO laws, once theoretical weapons, were now in full force, giving prosecutors the ability to dismantle entire organizations with one case. For the FBI, Scarfo was a perfect target. Philadelphia's mob family had become infamous for its instability, its volatility, its violence. The newspapers painted Scarfo as a dangerous tyrant. Politicians demanded results. And agents knew that behind the curtain of silence he had built, cracks were forming. Wiretaps and watchers. The FBI blanketed Philadelphia with surveillance. Restaurants, bars, union halls, every place Scarfo's men gathered became a hunting ground. Tiny microphones hid in ceilings. Wires ran under carpets. Conversations once considered private were now replayed in federal offices. Scarfo had always suspected his phones were tapped. He wasn't wrong. Agents recorded hours of his voice, sometimes catching nothing more than silence, other times capturing incriminating words. Even when he said little, his paranoia gave them clues. His tone, his pauses, his endless testing of loyalty. The turncoats. But technology wasn't the FBI's strongest weapon. Fear was. Scarfo's reign of suspicion had driven his own men to the breaking point. Soldiers who lived every day under the threat of sudden execution began to look for a way out. The FBI offered one: protection, immunity, new lives under new names. One by one, men who had once sworn loyalty to Scarfo began to flip. Some were low-level soldiers, desperate to escape the coffin of paranoia. Others were higher-ranking, exhausted by the endless fear. Each one gave the FBI another piece of the puzzle. Together they built a map of Scarfo's empire, its businesses, its rackets, its murders. Scarfo's greatest fear had become his reality. Betrayal wasn't just possible. It was everywhere. Paranoia meets reality. Scarfo reacted exactly as expected. He tightened the screws even harder. Meetings grew shorter. Access shrank further. Punishments grew more brutal. He doubled down on the very methods that had created the problem in the first place. But now, the more paranoid he became, the more evidence the FBI collected. His eruptions, his orders, his silences, all of it was captured, documented, stacked into files that grew thicker by the day. For Scarfo, paranoia was survival. For the FBI, paranoia was proof. The watching city. Philadelphia itself felt the tension. News stories hinted at investigations, though few knew how deep they went. Union leaders were summoned before grand juries. Business owners found themselves questioned by agents in dark suits. The city buzzed with rumors that Scarfo's reign was cracking. Ordinary people, who had whispered his name in fear for years, now whispered it with curiosity. Was the paranoid Don finally cornered? Could the government do what bullets and betrayals had failed to achieve? Inside the trap. The FBI didn't rush. They waited. They listened. They built their case brick by brick, confident that Scarfo would never change his ways. And he didn't. He couldn't. Paranoia had become not just his strategy but his identity. The more he suspected, the more his men deserted him. The more they deserted him, the more he suspected. It was a spiral with no bottom, and the FBI was there at every turn recording the fall. The inevitability of betrayal. In the end, Scarfo's paranoia wasn't wrong. He was surrounded by enemies. But he had created them himself. His men didn't betray him because they hated him. They betrayed him because they were already living as if they were guilty. Every day under Scarfo felt like a death sentence waiting to be carried out. When the FBI offered a way out, many didn't see it as betrayal at all. They saw it as survival. And so, Scarfo found himself in the position he had always feared most. A man surrounded not by loyal soldiers but by ghosts, men who smiled at him by day and whispered to the FBI by night. The net closes. By 1987, the case was ready. Indictments rolled out. Federal agents swept through Philadelphia, knocking down doors, dragging men from their beds. The headlines were loud now, filled with the name Scarfo had tried so hard to keep in shadows. The paranoid Don had been right all along. Betrayal was inevitable. But he had never imagined it would come from so many directions, so completely, so decisively. Scarfo, the man who trusted no one, now had no one left to trust. Philadelphia exhaled as the FBI's net closed tight. For years, the city had lived under Scarfo's paranoia. Now it was his turn to live under theirs. By the late 1980s, the Philadelphia mob family no longer resembled a family at all. It was a skeleton, stripped of trust, muscle, and cohesion, barely held together by Scarfo's iron grip of paranoia. But even iron corrodes, and his empire was crumbling from within. The hollowed-out family. What once had been a powerful organization of soldiers, capos, and allies now looked more like a scattering of frightened men waiting for their turn on the chopping block. Every killing, every disappearance, every whispered accusation had chipped away at the foundation. Scarfo hadn't just ruled by fear. He had burned through his own army with it. Loyalty was no longer a virtue. It was a liability. Men who stayed close risked suspicion. Men who distanced themselves risked being seen as disloyal. There was no safe place to stand. Some soldiers became paralyzed, doing as little as possible, hoping invisibility would save them. Others gambled on betrayal, running to the FBI with stories, deals, and pleas for protection. Each choice weakened the family further, tearing it apart piece by piece. Fear replacing business. The Philadelphia mob had once been profitable. Construction rackets, gambling operations, union control, these had been engines of money and influence. But under Scarfo, paranoia strangled business. Contractors hesitated to deal with him, afraid that even successful ventures might end in suspicion. Union leaders grew reluctant to meet, worried that simple negotiation could be mistaken for conspiracy. Revenue shrank. Profits dwindled. The family was spending more energy watching itself than running rackets. Fear had replaced business as the family's main product. And unlike money, fear wasn't a resource you could reinvest. The FBI exploits the cracks. Federal agents knew exactly what was happening. They didn't need to invent pressure. They simply leaned on what Scarfo had already created. Each time a soldier was arrested, agents reminded him of his reality. You know he doesn't trust you. You know you're next. And it was true. Many of the men they approached were already marked in Scarfo's mind. They didn't need convincing. They needed escape. One by one the defectors piled up. Some provided small details, addresses, phone numbers, the locations of meetings. Others handed over entire playbooks, mapping Scarfo's empire with shocking precision. Together they created an avalanche of evidence that no amount of paranoia could stop. The loneliness of leadership. Scarfo had always been a solitary figure, but now his solitude was absolute. He no longer had trusted advisors, only messengers who carried his words with trembling hands. Conversations grew shorter. Orders became sharper. He trusted nothing and no one, not even the silence of his own home. There's a certain kind of loneliness that comes with power. For Scarfo, it was the loneliness of knowing he had achieved exactly what he wanted. A world where betrayal was impossible because betrayal had already happened everywhere. He lived in a city of ghosts, ghosts of allies, ghosts of family, ghosts of trust. The turning point. The collapse came not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small ones. Each arrest chipped away at the illusion of control. Each defection pulled another thread from the fabric of the family. There was no single betrayal that broke Scarfo. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each delivered by the very men he had trained to live in fear. By 1988, it was clear to everyone except Scarfo himself. His empire was gone. What remained was a shell of suspicion, brittle and hollow, waiting for the final blow. Philadelphia reacts. For the city, the collapse was both a relief and a revelation. Relief because Scarfo's suffocating paranoia had made life unbearable. Revelation because his downfall proved a truth many had suspected. Fear can control, but it cannot endure. Ordinary Philadelphians read the headlines with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. The man who had terrified them for years was now being undone not by rivals, not by gunfire, but by the very fear he had worshipped. The lesson in collapse. Scarfo had believed fear was eternal. That men controlled by paranoia would never dare to defy him. But he had misunderstood the nature of fear. Fear doesn't make men loyal. It makes them desperate. And desperate men will eventually do anything, including betray the one who terrified them. His paranoia had been both sword and shield. Now it was the poison in his veins. By the time Scarfo finally faced indictment, his family had already collapsed. The FBI didn't need to crush him. He had done it himself. His suspicion had eaten through every bond, every alliance, every tie that held the Philadelphia mob together. Scarfo had built his empire from within. Now it had collapsed from within. The courtroom is not a boardroom. There are no shadows to hide in, no subtle stares to deliver judgment, no silent signals that decide life or death. In a courtroom, light fills every corner. Names are spoken aloud. Accusations are carved into the record. For Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo, it was the one stage he could never control. The arrest and the headlines. In 1987, federal agents finally moved in. Scarfo, who had spent years convincing himself that betrayal lurked in every corner, now faced the undeniable truth. Betrayal was no longer in the shadows. It was in the headlines. Newspapers splashed his name across front pages. Scarfo indicted. Philadelphia mob boss faces racketeering charges. Television anchors, once cautious with their words, now spoke his name boldly, dissecting his empire piece by piece for millions of viewers. Scarfo had always loathed publicity. He believed attention was weakness, visibility was death. Now he had no choice. America was watching. The courtroom theater. The trial became theater. Prosecutors laid out charts, photographs, ledgers, pieces of evidence that painted a picture of paranoia turned into policy. They described how Scarfo had turned union halls into slaughterhouses, how he had drained construction projects like a parasite, how he had silenced dissent with bullets and blades. But the most powerful evidence wasn't paper or photographs. It was people. The parade of betrayals. One by one, Scarfo's former allies took the stand. Men who had once toasted him in smoky backrooms now raised their right hands, swearing oaths to tell the truth. Their voices trembled, but not from fear of Scarfo anymore. Their fear now was of perjury, of the government, of a system stronger than the mob. A capo described in detail the way Scarfo's paranoia turned meetings into nightmares, how silence was often deadlier than words. A soldier testified about carrying out orders against men who had done nothing more than make Scarfo uneasy. Even family members, once bound by blood, spoke of his suspicion, his cruelty, his iron grip that strangled love from their lives. Each testimony was another cut, another reminder that Scarfo's paranoia had not saved him, it had ensured his isolation. The dawn reduced. In the boardrooms of Philadelphia, Scarfo had seemed untouchable. Even his silence could dominate a room. But in court, stripped of shadows and backed only by lawyers, he seemed smaller, literally and figuratively. Reporters described him as wiry, fidgeting, his eyes darting across the room as if searching for invisible enemies. For a man who had built his power on fear, the sight was almost pitiable. The paranoid Don looked paranoid still, but now it read not as menace but as weakness. The jury saw it. The public saw it. Even his own men saw it. Scarfo's aura of terror had evaporated under the fluorescent lights of federal justice. The government's case. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. It allowed them not just to charge Scarfo for individual crimes, but to present him as the head of a criminal enterprise responsible for decades of violence and corruption. The case tied his paranoia directly to his crimes. His suspicion wasn't just personal, it was organizational. Every execution, every disappearance, every union scam flowed back to him. His fear had become his system of governance, and that system was now laid bare in the courtroom. The verdict? It didn't take long. After weeks of testimony, charts, and cross-examinations, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Scarfo was sentenced to 55 years in federal prison. For a man already in his 50s, it was effectively a life sentence. The paranoid Don, who had once ruled Philadelphia from the shadows, would now live out his days under the harsh light of prison cells. The silence after the storm. When the gavel fell, Philadelphia exhaled. The reign of fear was over. Bars whispered his downfall. Union halls, once silent under his gaze, buzzed with cautious relief. Ordinary citizens who had once lowered their voices at the mention of his name now spoke it openly, almost with disbelief. But Scarfo's paranoia didn't vanish with the verdict. Even in prison he trusted no one. He suspected guards, inmates, even his own lawyers. The walls didn't free him from his fears, they amplified them. He lived behind bars exactly as he had lived in Philadelphia, surrounded by enemies real or imagined. The final lesson. The trial of Nicodemo Scarfo wasn't just the downfall of one man. It was a lesson written into American history. Paranoia can build an empire, but it cannot sustain one. Fear can control men, but it cannot keep them. In the end, those controlled by fear will always seek escape, and often, that escape comes at the expense of the tyrant himself. Scarfo left the courtroom not as a don, not as a ruler, but as a prisoner. His silence, once a weapon, was now meaningless. His paranoia, once his shield, was now his curse. And Philadelphia at last began to breathe again. Legacies come in many forms. Some men leave behind wealth, others monuments, still others memories of kindness. Nicodemo, little Nicky, Scarfo left behind something different, something darker. His legacy was fear. Not the quick flash of fear that comes with violence, but the slow, suffocating kind that seeps into a city, a family, a generation, and refuses to let go. Life behind bars. After his conviction, Scarfo disappeared into the federal prison system. There were no more boardrooms, no more whispered meetings in smoky backrooms. The only shadows he now commanded were those cast by the bars of his cell. But even here paranoia ruled him. Fellow inmates recalled how Scarfo kept to himself, scanning faces in the yard as if every man might be an informant. Guards noted his distrust. He accused them of tampering with his food, watching his letters, conspiring against him. For Scarfo, prison didn't change the world. It only confirmed what he had always believed. Betrayal was everywhere. He never softened. He never admitted mistakes. To his final days, he carried the belief that his paranoia had been justified. The family in fragments. Outside the walls, his blood family fractured. Children grew estranged, nephews carried scars of years under his suspicion, and relatives who had once feared him now spoke of him with bitterness. Some testified against him. Others walked away entirely. None carried his legacy with pride. The Scarfo name did not inspire loyalty or nostalgia. It inspired a shiver, a whispered warning about what paranoia could do to a man. In American culture, mob bosses are often remembered as larger-than-life figures, charismatic, stylish, romanticized in movies and television. But Scarfo's story lacked glamour. His reign produced no folk heroes, no golden memories. Only fear. Philadelphia's memory. For Philadelphia, Scarfo's rule became a cautionary tale. The city had endured mobsters before, and it would endure them after. But none had warped the city's atmosphere the way Scarfo had. Under his rule, silence became survival. Even decades later, old-timers recalled those years not with awe, but with unease. Bars where he once held meetings remained haunted by memory. Union halls that once trembled under his stare carried an invisible scar. Philadelphia itself seemed to exhale only after he was gone, as if the city had been holding its breath for years. The contrast with others. Other dons left behind strange forms of respect. Al Capone became legend. John Gotti, even in downfall, retained a kind of twisted admiration. But Scarfo? Scarfo was remembered as the paranoid don, the man who trusted no one and was undone by everyone. Even among mob historians, his name carries less glamour and more dread. He wasn't loved, wasn't admired, wasn't celebrated. He was feared. Only feared. And fear does not build a lasting dynasty. The final years. Scarfo lived in prison until 2017, when he died at the age of 87. By then the world had changed. The Mafia was a shadow of its former self, the FBI had long since dismantled the old empires, and younger generations barely knew his name. But those who did remember spoke of him not as a king but as a caution. They remembered the small man with the sharp eyes, the don who mistook paranoia for strength, the ruler who destroyed his own kingdom from within. He died as he lived, suspicious, isolated, unrepentant. The lesson of Scarfo. Scarfo's legacy offers a lesson not just about crime but about power. Fear can build an empire but it cannot sustain one. Paranoia can protect a man for a time, but eventually it consumes him. In Scarfo's case, it consumed his family, his organization, his city, and finally himself. The tragedy of Scarfo is not that he fell. All mob bosses fall. The tragedy is that he left behind nothing but silence. No loyal heirs. No enduring respect. Only the memory of years when Philadelphia was held hostage by one man's suspicion. Closing image. Picture Philadelphia in those years. Blinds drawn, whispers cut short, meetings ending in silence. Picture Scarfo in his cell, older now, still scanning faces for betrayal, still pacing like a guard against enemies who no longer existed. That is his legacy, not wealth, not fame, not honor. Just fear. Epilogue reflection. Scarfo's story belongs to America's larger history of organized crime, but it also stands apart. It strips away the romance, the illusion of honor among thieves, and shows the truth of what happens when paranoia becomes power. The legacy of little Nicky Scarfo is not a legend to admire. It is a warning to remember.